morning, everyone. My name is Jody Souza. I am the Education and Events Manager with C.A.R. And this morning I'm joined by William Che, who is the current Vice Chair of the C.A.R. Forms Committee. And he's also a C.A.R. Board of Directors member. And I'm also joined by Neil Kalin, who is a C.A.R. attorney. He does a lot with the legal helpline, and he's also the senior advisor on the legal side to the C.A.R. Forms Committee. So they are going to go through a ton of questions, facts and myths. So if you have any questions, my suggestion is to listen to most of the presentation because again, we are going to be answering a lot of questions this morning, but if you do have a question, you can put it into the chat box or into the Q&A box, and we will answer as much as we possibly can at the end of the presentation. So Will, I'm going to turn it over to you and Neil to let everybody know about contracts PEDS during COVID.
Well, good morning, everyone. We are super excited that you were able to make it this morning. We're going to try and make this as interactive as we can in our new virtual reality here. And we've got Neil here, so that means that it's going to definitely be fun. So Neil Kalin, as Jody said, is one of the legal team advisors that we have on the Forms Committee. I met Neil several years ago, and I always give Neil credit. People that have done my contracts class seem to enjoy them, and quite frankly, I modeled it off of Neil. If those of you that have been around for a while remember when the RRR form was first introduced, I want to say maybe that was 5 or 6 years ago. I went to a training, a contracts class that Neil did where he was also introducing that. And he actually got up on stage and said, you know, hey, we've got a new form. It's called the R. And he put on a pirate hat with an eye patch and the whole 9 yards. And I said, you know what? This man knows what he's doing. He's making this fun. I got to model myself after that. So and then I was blessed, especially this year with being the vice chair, to work even closely with him. And I just want to thank him and his team for the yeoman's work that they did this year. For those of you that have been around for a while, you know that, you know, our forms, not just because of some of the rules that we have with the association where we just can't go and review forms willy-nilly, but they really stepped up to the plate this year and made a lot of adjustments. Quite frankly, a lot of it was done on the fly to protect us practitioners. So thank you very much for you and the team's work, Neil. So this morning, Tim Bobian, who was promoted this month to our Government Affairs Director, we called him the GAD, he was not able to make it today to kind of give us an update on what's going on with our government affairs team and what they're doing to make sure that not only we are able to, you know, continue to be an essential service, but to kind of try and normalize, quote unquote, our business even more. So again, I want to thank Tim for that, but just wanted to go over some of the things that he and the team are doing at the federal, state, and local level. They're really working hard to ensure further direct mortgage and rent relief to help those most vulnerable housing providers, homeowners, and to tenants. At the federal level, we're also fighting to extend unemployment benefits, which unfortunately, as of right now, end this week. Tim says that they're also working on continuity and clarity at the state and local levels as to what aspects of real estate transactions are essential, and to make transactions as easy and normal as possible for our members and our clients, and, you know, while still maintaining healthy and safe measures. And then lastly, we've got several important ballot measures to focus on for the November election, including supporting Prop 19, which is the tax portability, opposing Prop 15, which is a split roll property tax for commercial properties, opposing Prop 21, that's going to try to remove Costa-Hawkins to allow more stringent rent control by local jurisdictions. So if you would permit me just a moment here to get on my soapbox, I know a lot of us, from time to time just question, oh my God, our dues are high. And what does, organized real estate do for us? Guys, right now, this is the prime example of what your membership for SCORE and those of you that contribute to the Realtor Action Fund, the RAF Fund, I think everybody needs to start contributing to that now, because quite frankly, those contributions are the direct reason why we, at the very beginning of this, were one of the first industries that was considered essential. And quite frankly, when they've shut down a lot of the things that were considered essential, we still remain open on and are allowed not only to do business, help our clients, but quite frankly, feed our families. So, huge props go out to Tim and his team, and to Dave Walsh and his team, and President Jeannie over at C.A.R. And another local, person who is our president of NAR, for doing, great work, making sure that we are able to stay open. So let's get into it. Neil is going to take over here in a few. We're going to go over most of the COVID-19 forms that were just revised. Most of them were revised, and again, on the fly, really good stuff. So we're going to take a look at the posted rules of entry. That's the Form PRE. We're going to look at the Form B PPP, the mandatory government showing requirements, including best practices, guidance, and the prevention plan. We'll take a look at the PED-S, which is the Coronavirus Property Entry Advisory and Declaration. Obviously, it's the S, so that's for the seller / the occupant. The PED-V, the one that we probably use the most, the Coronavirus Property Entry Advisory and Declaration for any and all visitors. We'll take a look at the listing agreement for the coronavirus addendum for the listing agreement. That's the addendum or amendment. That's the RLA CAA form. The coronavirus addendum or amendment, the Form CVA, and the notice of unforeseen coronavirus circumstances. So, Mr. Kalin, you are up, sir.
Wow. Okay, so great. Thank you very much. That's a nice introduction. And of course, I'm an attorney here at C.A.R.'s staff, and I am a huge supporter of the staff at the state and local level, really government affairs at the local level, that try to get the realtor point of view across to government representatives so that they know what you need to do to make a living, how hard it is for you to make a living, and to enable you to keep making a living. So anybody who wants to donate, as Bill said, at your local level or at the state level, it is money well spent. It's very difficult to get good legislation passed, and it's difficult also to prevent bad legislation from being passed, whether it's at the local level or at the state level. So that was a great introduction, Will. But now I'll just jump into these coronavirus forms that you really wanted me here for. And the first one is the posted rules of entry. And what about the posted rules of entry? Well, this is kind of a two-part form. You'll see the second part in just a minute, which is just the pictogram. This is the part that has, some more text to it. And the reason we have this form is that the California Department of Public Health issued guidelines, and guidelines is a real misnomer because Department of Public Health guidelines are requirements. That's one of the requirements, is that rules of entry of a property. So they have specific, DPH, Department of Public Health, has specific rules for real estate. And one of those rules is that there need to be specific rules posted for entering a property. And this document, both sides, so the second one that Will just has in your screen right now is just a pictogram, right? So if you can go back for a moment. Thank you very much, Will. And the rules of entry have to say certain things. So the importance that if you're going to enter this property, you have to agree to wash your hands, you have to agree to wear a protective face covering, you have to practice social distancing, you have to avoid touching surfaces. So you've got all this information here. And again, it has to be at the entrance of the property so that everyone sees it and acknowledges it before they move in. So one thing that was different here, so these forms changed on the 13th of July, and they changed on the 13th in response to changes that were made by DPH on July 3rd. So right before the July 4th weekend, they changed a bunch of their rules just to ruin everybody's weekend, right? And so C.A.R. evaluated our forms, evaluated our documents, came back the following week, made some or proposed changes, brought our changes back to our standard forms committee that we're so lucky to have Will as a vice chair on right now. And we made some changes. Really, what was the biggest change to the posted rules of entry? Well, really, one of the items is missing. So right now you see 4 pictograms, and on the next page you'll see there's just 4. There used to be 5. What was the 5th one? The 5th one talked about discarding disposable items, disposable face masks, disposable gloves. If people had disposable, shoe booties, I'm not even sure what the right phrase of that is out in the field. But they got rid of that. They got rid of that because they realized, hey, guess what? I guess maybe some people keep these things, right? Some people say, hey, I kind of like this face mask, so I'll just keep it around, or I'll give it to my kids to make some kind of a project, out of, or something, or a quilt or something, who knows? So they said, forget about, discarding these things immediately upon exiting the property. But basically the rest of the PRE form stayed the same. Now, not only is this form that need to be posted on the property, but if you have a listing and the listing is placed in the MLS, you have to have a notice of these rules there as well. And so I think that takes us through the PRE, and we're ready to go on to our next form. So again, this is just the pictogram part. So the next one, this is we call it a document because it's not really a standard form, right? So this is one of our documents, just like the PRE is a document. It's not technically a form. And this one, you see the title up there, Mandatory Government Showing Requirements, including best practices, guidelines, and preventative plan. So for short, BPPP, best practices and preventative plan. And the wonderful thing about this form right now is that it's only 2 pages. Now, when we started with this form, it was 8 pages.
Yep.
And boy, did we hear from our members when we first put this form out. But very shortly after that, we immediately reduced it down, I think, to 5 pages without changing any of the text. It was just the spacing and the formatting and the font was just set up in such a way it was just really unnecessarily long. And then afterwards, we looked at it and we said, you know what, there's a lot of duplication between this BPPP document and the PED forms, whether it's the PED for the seller, or whether it's the PED for the visitor, or whether it's that posted rule of entry document. So then we went through and we said, we don't need any of this duplication. So we got rid of all of the duplication. So we originally went from 8 down to 5. Then by getting rid of all that duplication, again, making sure that we have at least a readable font, but not too large and it's taking up too much extra space, getting rid of certain signatures and acknowledgements, wound up bringing it down to 2 pages. So that was a really good thing that happened recently. The BPPP really acknowledged a couple of things. So why don't we go back up to the first page if you don't mind. Thanks, Will. And it talks about the showing rules, okay? And let's look at number 2. And unfortunately, I've got a small screen, so I'm going to put on my glasses so I can see it a little bit better. And here we go. So we go to showing rule number 2, and it says, do not hold traditional open houses or showings which are open to the general public on a walk-in basis. And then for all in-person visits, agents must use an appointment or digital sign-in process to control the number of people in the house or property, and cleaning, social distancing, and other government guidelines need to be followed. That language is new, and the language in number 3, if you are going to hold a non-traditional open house, which means something that you're allowed to do in the current environment, okay, it has to be in compliance with the government rules, and it talks about open house signs and advertisements that they need to reflect that it's not really a true open house anymore. So that was one of the big changes here. And one of the reasons for that is the previous version of the public health documents, the guidelines, explicitly said no open houses. They removed that language from the guidance. So they removed the language that said no open houses, but they kept all of the rules for showing. So it was kind of odd because, well, is it an open house? Well, not really, not in the way that most agents, not in the way that most members of the public. Most members of the public think, oh, if there's an open house, I could just drop on in and walk through the property. That's the whole point. A listing agent is there, maybe an assistant is there as well. They take sign-ins, they want, they want to get prospects to the property. None of that is allowed. So even though the guidance changed so that there was no longer this explicit prohibition on, quote, open houses, all of the rules stayed the same. And we were concerned that people would have heard about this change to the rule and think, oh, it's just business as usual now. It's business back to normal, back to the way it was pre-COVID. And it really wasn't. So probably the most significant change here is in paragraphs 2 and 3, which define if you're doing a showing, is it an open house? Well, not really. And certain things that you need to be careful about. And I think we're going to get a little more into that when we get to some of our questions a little bit later. So that's kind of a preview for what's coming up. So that was one of the biggest differences. Another thing, and then I think you can go down to the next page, Will, for this next item. Thank you. And the cleaning and disinfecting section, so right there at the top. And what does it start off? It says the agent who shows the property shall follow cleaning and disinfecting protocols, okay? So it was never very clear, and quite honestly, it's still not very clear, who has the ultimate responsibility? The agent who's in the property, who's facilitating the showing, or the listing licensee? And our earlier version of the BPPP form said, you know what, really, regardless of what happens, if you're listing property, that burden falls to you. And so people looked at this and say, well, maybe you cannot even delegate the cleaning responsibility to a showing licensee, to someone who's bringing a buyer in. And so we said, well, the rules really were not that explicit. We think you can interpret it to allow the showing licensee to make sure that they do a proper cleaning, certainly when they're through with the showing. Because remember, properties have to be cleaned before and after each showing. So if it's cleaned afterwards and there's no one who comes in between, then guess what? It's cleaned beforehand. It's cleaned before the next showing, so that's good. But we wanted to make these rules allow for that, as opposed to reading the DPH guidance so narrowly that it seemed to require a listing licensee to be present for every single showing, because that's not the practice everywhere throughout the state. And those are the two biggest differences, I think, that to this document, the BPPP document. I think I'm ready for the next one, Will. Okay, so here we have the PEAD form, right? What does that stand for? Property Entry Advisory and Declaration. That D always gets to me because I work with standard forms so much. every time I see a D, it usually stands for disclosure. But in this context, the D stands for declaration. So I'm glad we have it up on the screen so I say the right thing this time, because I often see D and I just naturally what comes out of my mouth is the word disclosure. But for this form, it's a declaration. It's a representation by the seller, okay, as you see there in paragraph 5, that A, they're allowing people into the property, that they understand there are risks in doing so, that they're not afflicted with COVID-19. They have not knowingly within the last 2 weeks been in contact with somebody who is afflicted with COVID-19, and they don't exhibit any symptoms of that, right? So that's one thing this PED-S does. This is the PED-S, which stands for seller. That's the most important part. The seller is making this declaration, this representation, and this form should be made available to all entrants who want to see it, so that they can feel comfortable that, assuming the seller is acting in good faith, that their risk of contracting COVID-19 from going through the property because of the seller's condition or hopefully lack of condition, that their risk is minimized because of what the seller has represented. Now, there was a change to the PED-S in 713, but I have to tell you, the change was really just a technical change because a word changed in the guidance. So there's really no substantive change to the PED-S, because prior to 713, we added paragraph 6, where the seller is saying, not only am I making these representations for myself, I'm also making these representations for any minor occupants who may be in the property, right? There could be children, there could be others as well in the property. So while there was a change, it was so minor, it was really insignificant. Normally, we would not even have changed the date of the PED-S to 713, but because we were already changing the date on that rules of entry, we were changing it on the BPPP, we changed it on the PED-V because of some more significant changes. We said, won't it be easier for members if most of our coronavirus forms have the same date, so that they that can avoid confusion moving forward. So like I say, a real technical change, did not change any of the substance at all, but we changed the date because we thought it would be easier for everybody to follow along when most of these forms now will have a 713 date. That's all I have to say about the PED-S, Will.
Well, we've got a couple of questions that I think we can get to right now.
Sure.
Going back to the posted forms, we got a question: is the posted sign still required? Thought I saw something with one of the latest governor announcements that realtors no longer had to post a sign on the property.
Okay, so they are still required. Matter of fact, I have up on my other screen, I have the guidance, and it is, that requirement is still in the guidance. As I say, the guidance is more than guidance. The guidance is really a requirement.
Perfect. And then on this particular form, on the S, now this person may have asked the question thinking it was the V, but I'm going to make sure that we get to everybody's questions. Can you have multiple addresses on this form?
Okay, so I think you're right. I think there was probably a confusion because we have really 3 different PED forms. We have one, which is -S for sellers or occupants. We have one, which is -V for visitors, who could be buyer prospects, could be appraisers, could be inspectors, could be work people, could be anybody, so a -V. And then we also have a -LR, which is used in the rental context. So, but for the S, you would not need multiple addresses. For the S, you really just need one address. And I'm looking here and I see, oh, it does say property address or address is. So that's right there at the top. So that's something that we should probably be corrected. I think we just carried over that property address line from the PV. So yes, for the PED-S, it only makes sense for this to be one property. I suppose in a rare circumstance, if the seller is selling 2 different properties that have different addresses and different APNs, that might be a time where you could use one PED-S, but that's going to be so rare. Really, the real answer is for the PED-S, It should just have one property address.
We've got a great question from Jeanette Rosales. How do we handle non-English speakers who we need to provide the PED forms to?
Okay, so really it's no different than how you handle non-English speakers in any other context in the sale, which is if you are not comfortable that the non-English speaker understands the nature of the documents that are being provided, you can handle it one of two ways. If you speak the language of the non-English speaker, you can provide your own translation, your own interpretation. That is one thing. The
Perfect.
better approach, quite honestly, is to have the non-English speaker delegate their own person to interpret or translate. And again, it would be no different than any other document that you're providing. If you're working with somebody, and let's say this is a buyer prospect, maybe you're one of the rare licensees in California who use a buyer representation agreement. Well, at that point, you would want to have somebody explain what this agreement is all about. If the client does not understand English, you speak English, you do not speak the client's language, you'd want to have the client delegate somebody. And we have a form, it's called ITA, Interpreter Translator Agreement, that gets signed by the principal, by the licensee, and by the interpreter, where you say, this is where the client says, this is the person that I am relying on to explain an English language document. To me, it's the exact same thing.
All right. I think we can move on to the big one.
All right, the PED-V. Great. So again, this one was also updated 7/13, so the July 13th. What are a couple of changes here? So we actually combined some of the language that is now in paragraphs 2 and paragraphs 3. There was language there that was dealing with an explanation about what essential services are that we thought that's really not so relevant to a visitor because you're already providing the service. So why do we need to have that explanation at this point in time? So we combined some of the languages to tighten up the form itself. The purpose of entry, paragraph 4, is basically the same. The property entrant rules, well, what do we have there? Just like what we did in the PRE, we took out the language about discarding disposable coverings. We added some language to what you see here as paragraph 5F, because the guidance was very specific about what kind of things should not be touched. And we realized all of those things were not in the previous version of the PED-V. So we included that as well. And when we get down to the signer acknowledgements and representations, notice, oh no, stay there on the page, I'm sorry. So we're on paragraph 6 right now. Now, what is here? Notice in paragraph 6B, well, two things. Let's start with 6A, which is nothing new. No written materials or brochures should be at the property. All information should be obtained from broker or agent electronically. That was not changed, okay? 6B, just a reminder, look at here. A set of rules for agents will be posted at the property. That's what we were talking about with the PRE. That is still in the rules, that is still a requirement. So we wanted to make sure it was still mentioned. We look at 6C, and this just has to do with, advising to take care and to disinfect. 6D, an explicit acknowledgement of receiving the BPPP document, okay? The box is pre-checked, which means that BPPP is attached to the visitor PED form. And then E is good information because some people want to know where can they get more information. I mentioned a little bit earlier, I have up on my other screen, I have up the guidance. I have up on my other screen the checklist. So it's nice to know you may have, visitors, they don't know about this stuff. So maybe they want to investigate a little bit further. Great. You don't have to give them citations. The citations are right there for them. And in 7, the visitor really makes the same representations that the seller was making, right? They understand there's risk. They understand it's not risk-free. They make representations about their exposure to COVID-19 and the like. That really is all the same. So now I think we're ready to go to page 2. Something that was added was paragraph 8, right? Accompanying minors. So, we just needed to make sure that if somebody's bringing, again, usually it's children into the property. So people thought, well, I'm okay. I'm making a representation myself. And then somebody's coming in and they're bringing children. The children aren't going to be signing electronically. We want to make sure that that's covered. And again, you've got your agreement to these terms. You have the signatures. Notice the signature blocks, the one PED-V form can be used for up to 3 different entrants, right? We don't know, maybe they're going to be a buyer, maybe it's a tenant going to see a prospective lease, could be the agent who's going through to help show the property. So one form can be used for up to 3 entrants. And let's go back to page 1, Will, because this kind of goes to another question, which is above paragraph 1, property address. And notice it does say property address or addresses, right? And so it's possible to have one PED-V form used for multiple properties. Give you a good example. I happen to be going out to look at properties tomorrow. I'm looking for something for my brother-in-law and my father-in-law, and they want my father-in-law to really be, what they used to call like a granny suite, like right in the backyard. And that's exactly what we were looking for. I was working with an Asian in my area. She showed me some properties. It's like, no, these don't work. They don't want it to be in the same house. They need to be like an ADU. It needs to be in the back. And so my agent happened to find some properties the other day. She sent me a notice of them. I looked at them. I was interested. They all have that ADU in the back, so it would be a perfect setup for my family. Sent me last night, PED to sign, right? But it's going to reflect all 3 properties that we're going to see tomorrow. So I could sign one PED-V to cover 3 different properties. The issue is, the issue for a PED-V is that you sign a new PED-V for each date. You always want to identify the properties, but the key is going to be the date. It's date specific. And we see the date on page 2, if you don't mind turning back for just a second. Will, I saw there were some questions coming in, and if you want me to stop, I'll stop and we can answer some.
So we do have a couple of questions. One of them you did answer, but just wanted to make sure. Question was, can you have multiple addresses on this form? I think we answered that you can. How many, do you recall how many addresses that can be added to the form at one time?
I don't. If you go back up to that page, I will mention something that I think will be helpful. So go up to page 1. So you have a very long line, so that's good. Obviously, it will depend on the street name or the street address. But the other thing that my understanding is that in ZIP, and since these forms should all be prepared electronically, this is going to be very helpful to you, is that the address line is stacked. So it's really 2 lines there. So if you really need that extra space, you can do that because of stacking electronically in ZIP form. But it's really a matter of characters. It's not a matter of how many properties you can list. It's a matter of how many characters you can fit into that space.
Okay, another question, and they're coming in fast and furious, which is great. So an agent can put in quotes TBD for property address, correct? Or do they have to specify an address?
No, I think they do have to specify an address. First of all, these forms need to be provided to the listing agent for every property that the visitor is going to see or the property the visitor is going to be shown. Putting TBD does not help. You have not identified what property. So a listing agent will not know that while it's true you might be sending it to a listing agent, what if that listing agent it's a busy agent, has multiple properties. Putting TBD is not helpful at all. That is not how the form was designed. It was designed for specific addresses to be listed. So anytime there's a new address that's not listed, a new PDV is required. Anytime there's a entry on a new date, a new PDV is required.
So we've got another one that says, so in your example, you said PED was sent for signature the night before. Seller will have to sign and date it the day of visit, even if form is received the night before. This is not a 24-hour day, but specific date, correct?
Okay, so let's go to the signature page 2.
And I'm just going to ask everybody if they can put their questions in the Q&A section. I'm getting some in the chat as well, but with the Q&A, I have the ability to mark whether we've answered it or not, and I want to make sure that we get all of your questions answered.
Okay, great. So the importance of the date is for the entrant. It's the entrant who is making the representation. That's the importance of the date. I think it's fair that if a licensee sends the PDV out to somebody, the day or the evening before a showing, that the date's not really going to be the same date of the showing, but it's certainly in very close proximity to the date of the showing. I think anything that's really more than 24 hours, I would not be comfortable accepting a PDV that's more than 24 hours, okay? The acknowledgement where the agent signed and where the seller would sign, it's simply that. It's just an acknowledgement I've received it. Notice here, so at the very bottom, it says, we acknowledge receipt of a copy of the signed PDV form, and then the important language in the parenthetical. The initials below are not required, but can be used as evidence that the initialing party has received the completed form. So the most important date is for the visitor. The listing licensee may save them and have a relationship with the seller where they're providing them, I don't know, at the end of the week. I mean, to me, the better practice is you provide them as they come along. But is it necessary? No. Is it legally required for the seller to acknowledge? No. The important thing is that you got the representation. The representation is made by the visitor. The representation is dated. That's the most important thing.
We've got a thank you, Quinn, for putting this in the chat. She said that she can squeeze 4 addresses in, so awesome.
Okay, great.
We've got another question that says, please clarify, PED-S is specifically for prospect buyers, PED-V is for inspections or contract labor doing work on property.
Okay, so I will clarify that. PED-S is just for the sellers or the occupants, right? So we say occupants because some people may not be a seller. They may not be minor children. A good example, my adult child was living with me after college. He had a job. He wasn't certain how long he was going to stay in the job, did not want to enter into a lease. He was staying with me. He got a new job, could not move to the location of his new job because of COVID, and just recently, last week, moved. So if I were showing my property, I could not sign for my adult child who was living in my house. He's not the seller, I'm the seller, but he's an occupant of the property. And he really should be signing that PED-S form if I was in the situation where I was selling my property. The PED-V form, V like victory, is for anybody who is entering the property. So it could be a buyer prospect. It could be a buyer who was in contract. It could be an inspector. It could be an appraiser. It could be a repair person, right? The PV is for anybody other than the owner or occupant who is entering. And you may need multiple PVs in the same transaction because some people may come back to the property time and again. Sometimes buyers come in when they're a prospect, then they enter into contract, then they come for the inspection. So if they come with the inspector, assuming you can keep proper social distancing guidelines, then when they're visiting the property for the inspection, the buyer now will sign a new PV as well as the inspector. The buyer may come while certain repairs are being made. Guess what? The buyer will sign again because it's a different date, and the repair person will sign each time the repair person enters the property. Does that help out?
Just want to make sure every time somebody goes in the property for a second or third time, they need to submit a new PED for that date. Connie Martin has a great question. What might be an example of exceptions in paragraph 9?
Okay, a good exception would be maybe somebody was just tested and they found out that they're afflicted with COVID-19. That would be an exception, right? So they would write that into the exception. Maybe somebody is a first line primary care worker, right? So maybe they're working in a hospital. So they are exposed potentially to people who are afflicted with COVID-19. So they would write that into the exception. And then decisions would have to be made for somebody who has exposure, whether the seller feels comfortable allowing that person in, and whether the agents themselves feel comfortable being present for somebody who has had exposure, or whether there's alternatives, right, to in-person showings. And if nothing else, the recent pandemic has made it very clear that there's a lot of alternatives to in-person showing. There's really good virtual reality showings. There's a lot that could be done without somebody actually going onto the property. Much like you can get, depending on, especially if you're refinancing, you can get, a so-called drive-by appraisal. Well, maybe somebody who views the property online wants to get a sense for the neighborhood, so wants to drive by, stand out on the sidewalk, take a look, get a sense of what they're buying. So there's a lot of alternatives there, and those would be some good examples. Maybe somebody was at a party and they found out that somebody at the party was exposed, and so they're going to make that declaration as well. Those are a few examples I can think of. Well,
perfect. So for a question from Vicky, so if I have 3 buyers from one household seeing the house, all 3 are on one PED, I will initial on page 2. I will also need to submit a separate form for myself. Is that correct?
Okay, so you're the licensee. You're showing one buying party. That buying party has 3 people in it. Okay. But you are also going to be entering the property as the licensee because you're going to be doing the showing. Yes, you would sign a separate PV that only has your name, the licensee's name on it. That's correct.
Okay. So it said, so got a couple of statements from Sandra, which I want to get to. I asked this question about the date because there's been controversy among agents. Other C.A.R. speakers have said the form has to be dated the day of the visit. She also says it would be helpful if language could be added to the PED to make it clear that this has the date of the actual entry.
Right, so it just has a date that it's signed. Okay, so I see you think it would be helpful to have the date of the entry. That's certainly a comment. I'm writing that down. We could take that back to our standard forms committee, and our forms committee can decide, is that worthy of making another change to the form at this point in time? So that's certainly something to consider.
And then her last statement was,
well, let me get to the first one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I forgot the first one. the statements about signing date and visiting date. Okay. So I agree with many of my colleagues who say the best practice is to have the signing date and the visiting date be the same. But you heard me say before, if the signing date is the night before, and I'm going to see, so like I say, I'm going to see some properties tomorrow. So if I sign the property tonight, right, and I'm visiting tomorrow, and the PV is transferred through me to my licensee, to my buyer's representative, who then transfers it to the listing agent, made an appointment so everybody knows I'm going to see the property tomorrow. Is that good enough? I think the answer is probably yes. Okay, what difference does it make if it was a few hours, you know, and with those few hours taking me into the night before, or if I see the property at 8 p.m. and I signed it at 8 a.m. in the morning, okay? So to me, that difference is not significant enough. But as I said before, if you're going beyond a day, I don't think that's a good practice. I don't think it's a good practice for me to sign a PV today for anything that I'm going to be shown the rest of the week. There's too much that can happen. I think that's inconsistent with the spirit of the form, which is your declaration is within a reasonable period of time before the actual showing of the property. But yes, do I prefer that they all be done on the same day? Yes, of course I prefer that. I think that's the best practice. I'm just a little, I guess, maybe I have a little more realism in my answer than what you might get from some other attorneys.
So that's a good lead into another question that we got from Victoria. Victoria, did you say expiration of PV is only 3 days?
No, there really is no expiration of the PV. Again, I think you need a PV for each entry. Now, I've heard some people say that if you visit the property in the morning, and then you're going back late in the afternoon, that you need to sign 2 PVs. That's certainly the safe thing to do. That's certainly the cautious thing to do. From a risk management standpoint, that is the most safe risk-free approach. Okay? But a lot of this stuff is a balancing act. And I think we all have to recognize that there's a balancing act involved here. And if I looked at the property in the morning and then I went home, I didn't go shopping, I didn't go to a party with 30 people, right? I did not go to a bar and hang out with a bunch of strangers that I don't know. And now I'm going back to the property. Wow, my circumstance is really different in that second situation than it is from the first situation. I went home, I had my lunch, I took a nap, I did some work, and then I went back to the property in the afternoon. Okay, best practice, sign a new PV. What if I don't? Do I think it makes my one PV for the same date irrelevant? Nah, probably not. Again, some of the stuff you have to balance how things work out in practice, and you have to balance reality with what would be ideal.
We've got a question from Diane. Seller/occupant should sign a PED-S for each day the property is shown, correct?
Actually, that's one of those things. I'm glad you had that other question, because that points to the balance. That points to the balance, right? So while the C.A.R. forms and I think with the consent of the Standard Forms Advisory Committee, and believe me, will correct me if I misspeak here, was that visitors are kind of in a different category than sellers. Sellers are entitled to sign one PED-S, and that PED-S is good until the seller's circumstance changes. Because otherwise you'd have to have a seller sign a PED-S every time somebody came to the property. And that really changes the balance of things. That's, you know, an incredible inconvenience for a seller, okay? Especially if nothing has changed to the seller. And the sellers are there every single day, whereas visitors are not. And while some visitors may go back to the property a few times, and I've heard some visitors go back to the property 10 times. No, I know I never went to my property 10 times when I was buying the property, but some people, you know, do. Or maybe repair persons have to come back on multiple days to get things done. They're really in a different situation than the seller is. And again, you've got to balance convenience with what's realistic. And so what's realistic here is that the seller, the occupant, signs once, unless their circumstances change. If their circumstances change, they sign something new. Visitors sign each entry. Okay?
Great. Got a question from Pat. My understanding that only one household party, which is 2, plus the agent allowed in the home at one time, not inspector plus buyer plus agent. Am I correct?
Okay.
It's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we talk about buying parties, okay? And a buying party can be more than 2 people. And so I'm gonna break the question up a little bit. So let's say we're talking about a buying party, a buying prospect. You can have the listing licensee, you can have the buyer's licensee, and you can have the buyer's party, okay? Which may be more than one buyer. It could be 2 buyers. What if it's more? Well, you want to try to avoid that. Why do you want to try to avoid that? Because overriding all of this is the requirement that social distancing guidelines be maintained. And so the more people you have, the more unlikely it is that the social distancing guidelines will be able to be maintained. That's one thing. Number 2. And number 2, I think, goes to the other issue, which is, well, an inspector is not really a buying party, but maybe the buyer wants to accompany the inspector. So one could make a legal argument that the inspector is really there at the bidding of and at the behest of and as an extension of the buyer. So an inspector really is nothing more than a buying party. Okay, somebody can make that legal argument. But here, I think what you're really looking at is, again, what's going to fulfill the intent of the guidelines, okay? To minimize the exposure of strangers, to maintain social distancing. Those are the essential requirements here. And so you want to keep to a minimum the number of people who enter the property, right? And as the more people who are entering the property, the harder it is to keep track of people and to see what are they touching when they shouldn't be touching, right? So you want to try to minimize that. Is there a guidance that says one way or another? Well, not at the state level, but this takes me to another point, Will, which is you could have more restrictive requirements at the local level. Okay? You could have a requirement at the local level that says no in-person showings, right? So even though the state allows it, if your local government says no, you have to comply with the most restrictive requirement. You could have, and we have heard of this, of requirements at the local level that say no more than 2 people on the property plus a licensee. So when you're asking the question, the answer is, am I answering based on what the state guidance is? Or am I answering based on what the local requirements are? It is your responsibility to know if you have more restrictive local requirements than what the state allows. And that question about maximizing the number of people, there are jurisdictions that do have that kind of requirement. That's important for you to know that.
Great. All right. So Maria asks, so in the example you stated about your adult son living in your property, I have the same situation now. he and you would sign the PDS once for the duration of the listing in place with MLS active status, or each and every time you show as a seller the property? Please clarify.
My understanding is we only need to sign it once unless either of our circumstances changes.
All right. Schlipper, hopefully I didn't butcher that. I apologize. I rarely get a form from the seller side. Got it only twice. When I show my buyers, should I not get a PDS from the listing agent? It's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a prudent buyer's representative will ask for a PDS from the listing licensee. I think that's a perfectly reasonable request. You are, of course, you want to make a sale, and that's how you make a living, and I understand that. But you also want to show your client, who you are asking to sign this form, and maybe this form multiple times, right? Why does your own buyer client need to sign the form? Well, to inform others and to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So I think a way of showing your client that not only is this a responsibility on your end, it's also a responsibility on the seller's end. And I think it is a very fair request for you to say, hey, before I'm allowed into the property, I have to provide you, the listing licensee, my PDV form or forms. Well, guess what? My client is concerned, and I may be concerned myself, reasonably. So I want to see a PDS before I show my client the property. And I think that's an understandable request, and it's a request that should be complied with.
All right. Question from Ellis. Which form should the tenant prospect sign before entering the rentals?
And the tenant would sign the PDV, V like victory, the same form we're talking about right now.
All right. Julie Moore asked, is there an age limit for placing kids on the PDV form? Example, mom and dad bring their 3 and 5-year-olds. Should 2 PDV be used, or due to the age of kids, would they be exempt?
Okay, so in that case, the children are minors. The minors would need to be identified, and you're on exactly the right page here, Will. So if you look at paragraph 8, accompany minors, okay, signer acknowledges apply equally to any accompanying minors. And then you list the minors, because paragraph 9 is not just exceptions to the representations, it's also additional terms. So you would list the names of the minors, so you would not need, so even though you would have 4 people, 2 adults and 2 children, you really could do just one PDV form. The 2 adults sign in the signature line, and the 2 minors are named in paragraph 9.
Perfect. All right. Sherry writes, date of entry would be very helpful. Some listing agents require the PDV prior to giving codes and times to set up appointments for people to see the property. And often those tours are set up 2+ days ahead of showing. How to handle that? Signing date wouldn't be within 24 hours in that instance. Have to send 2 PDVs for same showing in those situations?
Yeah, Will, can you repeat that? Because I was not sure why. I guess I did not quite understand the question. Can you start it over again?
So this one, so we've been discussing today that, you know, we want to make sure that we get the PED to the listing agent either the day of the showing, or it's okay maybe the evening before, within the 24-hour period. Here in our market, where it's just absolutely nuclear right now with the activity, sometimes people will set up a tour, you know, 2 or plus days in advance. I know that, you know, I'm setting up tours, you know, once we're done today. So the question then becomes, and it's a great question from Sherry, how do we handle that? Signing date wouldn't be within the 24 hours in this instance. Do we need to send 2 PDVs, basically one for the day that we're requesting the appointment, and then we would send another one 24 hours before that time? It's a great question.
So So great. Now I have a better understanding of the question, and I may have to turn this back over to you, Will, being the practitioner, which I'm not. It actually sounds similar to my situation. Monday, my realtor set up appointments for Wednesday. But I'm not signing the PV on Monday. Maybe I'll sign it tonight, or maybe I'll sign it, tomorrow morning, when I get up in the morning, okay? But I don't have to sign it the day the appointment is set up. And I'm gonna do an accept or a but. And this is something that I don't know, but you as a practitioner would know better than I would, which is, does the listing agent require the PV be signed in order to set up an appointment in the first place? Or do they just say, you have to provide it prior to entry? What happens in your marketplace?
So I think both of those statements would be correct. I know that we have listing agents that want to do everything by the book, and I absolutely thank them and appreciate them and applaud them for that. But other agents may be a little bit loosey-goosey. My solution would be, as a buyer's agent, I would send the PED unsigned to the agent a couple of days before and say, per the guidelines, I understand that you want to make sure that we've got these signed, that you have these before you can secure a date for me, but it is not practical for me to give you the signature because the same guidelines say that we need to do it within 24 hours. Here are the names of my buyers, here's the form, and then I will send it off to you within 24 hours. Now on the other side, I think that that would be okay for a listing agent, but then the buyer's agent would have to be aware that if the listing agent does not get those documents within the 24-hour period of the showing, their date is no longer valid for them to go. That appointment is basically, in essence, canceled. So I think here we need to have everybody on the same page and cooperating. Does that usually happen? No, but I think that's a good practice for people to undertake.
And Will, while you were talking, I was actually able to pay attention to one of the questions that came in. And one of the questions was really a comment that said, listing agents, or in this person's experience was listing agents actually require a signed PV to make the appointment. Now, I think your approach is a reasonable approach. But if the listing licensee is saying, I won't even make an appointment until I have a signed PV first, and if that is their best practice that their broker insists upon, then in that situation, I don't see any other way than having two signed. One to get the appointment set up, and another on the date of showing, when you've got a period of time in between. I don't see the way to avoid that if the listing agent is insisting upon that as a condition of showing. I agree with you, though. I don't think it's necessary. I think you need to trust the buyer's representative that says, I'm telling you the name of my clients. We will get you a PV either on the day of the showing, or within a 24-hour period. Again, there's nothing in the rules that say 24 hours is some magic period. I'm just saying it's probably reasonable. But I want to make clear, there's nothing in the rules that say 24 hours. Some people are more reasonable than others. I guess I'm one of the reasonable types.
All right, great question from Alice. If tenant has COVID and has recovered in April, does this need to be declared? If so, does it go to paragraph 9?
Okay, great question. No perfect answer to that question. What I would want to know is, because just from what I've read and what we have in our PED forms, we talk about a 14-day period of time because that seems to be some kind of general guidance, right? As to how long, an infection may be possible. I have no idea what the medical answer to that is. Okay. But what I would prefer to see, and I think it would be reasonable to say, you do not need something to be written into paragraph 9 if the tenant has been retested and has been shown that they are negative, that they do not have any evidence of affliction with COVID-19. If that were the case, I'm thinking an exception does not need to be written in. If somebody wants to be really safe, they could write it in. But I don't think it would be necessary if there's been a subsequent test that's revealed no affliction. Okay.
Okay. Just a quick question or statement. Do all states have these PED forms? Why can't a buyer also simply sign one form stating that they declare that they accept the risk of viewing any property and that they will not enter any home if they are infected or have been in contact with anyone who has been infected? What difference does the address do?
Ah, okay. So great. So first of all, C.A.R. creates forms for California. No idea what other states do. I actually monitor a chat line for association attorneys throughout the United States. Some associations have had buyers and sellers and anyone, quite honestly, sign an explicit waiver and release of liability. C.A.R. did not go that far. These PED forms are not contractual documents. They're advisories, they're declarations. So C.A.R. was not comfortable with those waivers. We have an assumption of risk, okay? So we've done something differently than what some other states do. Some other states may not have any kind of documentation at all. That's up to them. C.A.R. is not concerned what other states do. The interest in having an address for the buyer to make a declaration is really to pin down the buyer and to make the seller understand that this buyer is looking at my property. Okay? So again, C.A.R. and our Standard Forms Committee and our legal staff looks at a variety of factors and tries to decide which ones are most relevant, or do we think are most relevant to our members, and with the minimal amount of interference with the transaction, but still giving relevant information. And that's the balance that we came up with, that an address and a date would be necessary.
Well, I also think that the form is great and we don't want to put in TBD, et cetera, because quite frankly, it's also a tool, God forbid, that somebody calls you and says, oh, by the way, either myself or my client has been exposed to COVID. So now we've got to basically use that as a tracing mechanism. If you have a property, let's say, listed on the MLS and people are making the appointments and it's been booked from 8 o'clock on Saturday all the way through 8 o'clock at night on Saturday and both days, you have a PED for every single visitor for each of those hours. If someone calls you on Tuesday and say, oh, by the way, one of us has been exposed to COVID, and you look and you say, okay, they were there on Sunday at 1 o'clock. Well, now I have to let everybody know from 2 o'clock on, hey, by the way, we had this exposure, just for your information. So it's something that, I mean, I think it's great for contract tracing as well, so that we can, help with, the tracing and making sure that we warn people. So I think, I may be just opining here, but I think for me, that is, a great use, of this form. All right, so we've got 8 questions left in about the PEDS. I'm going to ask everybody to hold off if you have other questions or statements so that we can get through everything else. Because
Will, before you go on,
yeah,
since I both agree with you and disagree with you on your last statement, I want to mention that rather than waiting.
Okay, sure, absolutely.
So, first of all, I completely agree with you that I think it's wonderful to have, a list, okay? Second, having a list certainly assists with contact tracing. I where I am going to slightly disagree with you is that it's not clear that there is a affirmative duty of a listing licensee to inform everyone who's been in the property before that somebody was tested and go back and notify everybody. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. I'm just not sure that it's an affirmative obligation when there is no fiduciary duty to those principles. Okay, so that's the one area where I'd say I don't know that I would have gone that far. I don't have a problem if somebody makes a notification, but I'm not sure it's an affirmative responsibility.
That's why I said it's I was opining. That's my personal opinion.
Great. Okay.
So I'm representing a seller every time I go in to look at property. Let inspectors in. So I'm not sure what that means, but I wanted to at least make you aware of that question. Richard says, here in Santa Clara County, limits to showing agents and 2 buyers living together. Neil is talking state regulations that are more liberal. We need to follow the more restrictive rules.
Absolutely.
Sandra says that the BPPP is very specific about the buying parties entering the property, correct? Doesn't it define the buying party as the agent if entering and one other person, or did I misread it?
I believe you misread that. Okay. And
who is responsible to sanitize the property after an inspector is done with his inspection?
Okay.
Good question.
So an inspector is a visitor. It's not really a showing, but I think it should be treated the same way. And much like we do with the buyer showing, whoever is allowing the inspector in, I think would have to take on that responsibility.
Okay. Maria asks, after you have several showings of your listing, what do you do with the PVs collected? As a listing agent, are we expected to send copies to seller's agents once those forms are executed, enforced, and collected?
Okay, say that again.
After you have several showings of your listing,
okay,
what do you do with the PEAD collected? As a listing agent, are we expected to send copies to the seller's agent once these forms are executed, enforced, and collected?
Okay, so what confused me there, and I think there was just probably a mistyping, was if you're the listing agent, you've had multiple showings. Question is, what do you do with the PEDVs that you've received? Well, you're going to keep them in your own file, and you want to provide them to the seller, to your seller client. So you're doing all of this electronically. You shouldn't be doing any of this with paper documents, so we don't think it's that onerous of a burden. And back to you.
All right, my buyers want to bring the contractor in to come to do their estimate before close of escrow. Is this allowed?
That is a showing. The issue is whether it's allowed under the contract. Okay, so under the contract, the buyer has a right of entry for a set period of time, right? The default is 21 days in the C.A.R. contract, may be different depending on your own personal contract, right? So, but if the seller will allow somebody to enter the property after the contractual right to enter has expired, then certainly that could be done, and you'd use the PEDV. Generally, after the contractual right of entry has expired, the only other right of entry is to do the, what's commonly known as a walkthrough, right? That's the only other contractual right of entry to the property. But I would say, hey, listing agent, seller, I have a contractor, I want to get some estimates. Do you have any objection to me showing the property to my contractor? And we'll follow all of the same showing rules that applied when I was looking at the property.
And our final question before we move on is from Gabrielle. Is the seller/agent allowed to decline a showing where all of the proper protocols are followed and all forms are completed and deliver timely? Great question.
Yeah, I actually, when I think about that question, I don't know why the seller's agent would want to deny the showing when everything has been done. Now, if there is something put into the exceptions, so all the paperwork is done, right? Maybe the buyer needs to write something into an exception for whatever reason. That document is provided to the listing agent. The listing agent provides it to the seller. At that point, there should be a discussion about the exception and whether the exception is putting the seller at risk and whether the seller is willing to allow the entry in spite of that. So, but in the absence of an exception, I don't know why a listing agent would deny entry when all the paperwork was done properly.
And then one last question from Diane. How about the day we give keys to the buyer? Seller is gone, but I'm delivering the keys to the buyers. Do I need to do a PEAD for myself?
Well, usually that is done on the date of close of escrow or after close of escrow, if the seller is staying, for some extended period of time. So the seller is no longer the seller. And so it's not a showing of property anymore at that point.
All righty.
So,
Well, let's move
say.
on. We've great questions, everybody. And hopefully, well, I don't think we're going to have time to get to any more for the PEDs, but we will do our best. So let us move on, Neil, to the listing agreement coronavirus addendum.
Okay, so this form should be taken at the time of the listing. Now you notice right up there at the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think it's 6 or 7 lines down. There's a box. This is an amendment to an already existing listing agreement. So of course, when we created this form, there may have been listings, before people thought about coronavirus and ways to approach it and dealing with best practices and property showings. But these days, it seems to me, when everybody takes a listing, they should at that point be thinking, wow, maybe we need to take the listing agreement addenda at the same time. The seller agrees to allow or not allow showings. The seller agrees or not agrees for marketing activities, post acceptance activities, which is 1, 2, and 3. And then you go on to page 2. If the seller is going to be restricting, paragraph 4 says, well, then you better talk to a lawyer about modifying some of the language in the contract. So this is an important form because it essentially sets the stage for the seller. These are the things that we need to be addressing in our current coronavirus environment. And here's what we're going to do to comply. So I think really all listings, this form really should not be introduced after a listing. These days, this form should be introduced at the time of the listing. That's all I have to say about that.
All right. So then let's move on to the coronavirus addendum or amendment, the CVA form.
Oh, great. So before I talk about this form, I want to ask you a question, Will.
Yes.
Because this was the very first coronavirus form that C.A.R. created. And you look at the date and say, my goodness, 4/30, April 30. We haven't revised this form since then. We've had multiple revisions, unfortunately, we've needed to stay up with the law for some of the other ones, but this one has really stayed the same. And the purpose of the CVA form, which is what you have on your screen, is to say, well, no one really thought about what would happen if you've got some pandemic that's really changing the way the whole world operates and the way the state operates. And so we said, this form is really, it modifies the purchase agreement. And so the question I have for you, Will, is now that we've been dealing with this, for 4 months, are people still using this form, or do they say, you know what, CVA, coronavirus, affliction of coronavirus, it's no different than any other change in circumstance that a buyer might have? Because the reason this form was created is we do not have an act of God clause in our contracts. And we said, and we don't know whether the impossibility rules apply because of COVID-19, because of the pandemic, because of the stay-at-home orders. So we need to have some language that can address this circumstance. But I don't know, maybe after 4 months, everybody's been so used to it, they say, you know what? If you get coronavirus, you're no different than if you lose your job before coronavirus. That's a circumstance, you buyer, that you're gonna have to live with, or you seller, you're gonna have to figure something else out too, or you're gonna be in breach of contract. I don't know what's happening out in the field. What's your experience with this one?
You've definitely got your hand on the pulse. That's pretty much spot on. I think people are looking at this, or at least most practitioners are, not using the form now because everybody is now used to it. Everybody is talking to their clients. They're informing them of what, is going on the market, what's the best standards and practice of what's going on. So I think, and again, I look at that date, 4/30. I mean, that's amazing that within 2 weeks of our local shelter in place, your team came up with a form. Now, yes, it was very controversial when it came out, but hell, nobody knew, how to handle this thing, right? So kudos to your team again for coming out with something that was, basically a stopgap for us, within the crazy time of selling or not selling or people just freaking out, those first few weeks. But yeah, you're right. I think, practitioners and the general public are used to it. This is now our everyday lives. So yeah, I think people are used to it. We're not using it as much. I think it's still a good form to have in your arsenal just in case. But of course, you've got to get a seller to sign it. So
Right.
again, it's more of how you, quote unquote, sell the form to the listing agent, and then they discuss it with their clients.
So that's really great information for me to have. So thank you, Will. And one of the good things about this form is you don't have to use it at the time the contract is entered into. So many things have changed. We weren't sure that showings were going to be allowed.
Yep.
We weren't sure that you can get appraisers, right? We weren't sure that you can get documents notarized and signed. So a lot of that stuff has kind of figured its way out because of the showing rules and the access rules. But still, if somebody gets afflicted with coronavirus, that may change the circumstance so dramatically that maybe at that point you introduce this, or you try to introduce this to amend the contract. But so it's like you said, it's good to have as a tool in case it's really necessary. So
And as a primarily listing agent heavy practitioner, I will break this form out during my listing presentation, or I make sure that my clients on the seller side are at least aware of this form just in case it comes up, so they know that somebody could send it in. So, just something on there. All right, moving on to our next form. It's the unforeseen unforeseen coronavirus circumstances, the notice of it.
Right, and so this form just works hand in hand with the one we just talked about,
Yep.
which is now you know what the circumstance is, you want to identify it, and maybe when you identify it, if everyone's acting in good faith, maybe you work something out. Maybe you attach the CVA form and you figure out how to approach it. But using a CVA without the NUCC, the one you have on your screen right now, I don't know, you might be a little bit suspicious of that. I think I'd want, especially as a listing agent and the buyer's coming in, I want them to show me, what has developed that's causing you to want to change our contract terms. And similarly, if a seller says something's really changed here, as a buyer, I'd want to, have the seller, prove up essentially what's going on.
All right. So that was it for the forms. So now let's get into some of these facts and myths. And I think we only have 5 more minutes. So we will send out the slide deck for everything else that we didn't cover. But let's see if we can go through some of these quickly. We were going to do a little interactive poll. I don't think we've got time for that. So our first fact or myth, open houses are allowed. And Neil?
Well,
I'm going to say it's both.
Yeah, it's both. As I said before, the guidance changed. It no longer specifically prohibits open houses, but it's kind of a myth because open house, as you are used to them and as the public is used to them, really are not allowed anymore.
Right.
right? You have to have appointments, you have to have showings in advance, you have to have digital signing.
All right, and this goes back to the question that we had. A broker cannot refuse to show a property. And I think that's a myth. I mean, I think on the Corona website, it says that a broker, you know, double negative, right? Cannot not refuse to show a property.
Right, so it's really a seller, really the main part is what they're talking about.
Right.
A seller can say, I don't want to show my properties at all, period. Virtual only. That can be done. A broker could say, I'm not going to do any in-person showings. I only want to do virtual. Or a broker could say, I can refuse, right? So cannot is a myth because brokers say, I can refuse if there's some exception to the PED that puts me or my client at risk.
I can't ask clients or others I interact with in my real estate business if they have any respiratory illnesses. Huge myth, people. Of course you can ask. We want you to ask. And I will even say, guys, we're an essential business, essential service. I think we should, as an industry, encourage our fellow practitioners to be tested at least once a month because we are interacting with the general public.
And the only qualification I would do with this, and I just noticed this right now, is you asked about respiratory illnesses as opposed to respiratory conditions. And let's say somebody has asthma. Okay, that does not mean that they're afflicted with COVID-19. They had asthma before the pandemic even started. So it may not be so much an issue of the illness as whether they're experiencing any respiratory symptoms that cannot otherwise be explained.
I typically drive my clients to showings. It's okay to continue to do so. Yeah, that's a myth. You know, we've got a social distance. If you're, you know, unless you're living in the house with that client, no, everybody meets you there and everything is by appointment only.
And that's also in the guidance, by the way, Will.
Yes.
Okay.
An agent should inform their older clients of the governor's recommendation to self-quarantine for those age 65 and older. That's a fact, people. So please encourage your older clients that they do need to self-quarantine because they are considered in one of those at-risk groups. A PED form filled with all inputted as the address is acceptable. We covered this in our questions. Huge myth. You've got to do them for each of the properties that you're going to go to. Buyers can sign PED V one time and reuse it for all showings. We talked about that already. That's a myth. All right, we're doing pretty good here. So we did do the questions. So some of the other questions that we got are, what are my clients' disclosure obligations if someone in the home tested positive for coronavirus?
Okay, so I think we kind of touched upon this a little bit. So I think you have your client, if you're the listing agent, you have your client write the exception in the PEDS. You make that PEDS available for any buyer prospects or any entrant prospects. And we talked a little bit about, well, what's the obligation if you discover this after the property has already been shown? Do you have to go back and inform everybody who's been into the property? And my answer was, I'm not sure there's an affirmative obligation for those prospects with whom you do not owe a fiduciary duty, so they're not your clients, okay? I think Will was taking a more proactive response, saying as a practitioner, you thought it was a good idea to do that, and I can't disagree with that advice. I'm just not sure that it's a legal mandate.
All right, and are we required to keep, I love this question, are we required to keep PEDS for 3 years to meet DRE requirement timeline?
And what's your answer to that one, Will?
I would say, yeah. I mean, I keep it. I'm a pack rat, and now with digital technology, you can put it, you know, in the cloud. I keep all of my documentation.
And the answer, of course, is yes, because you have to keep all of your transactional documents, and that affects the transaction. So yes, of course.
If a tenant will not sign a PED, can we still bring in inspectors, appraisers, etc.?
A tough issue, my pragmatic answer is no. If normally a owner of property, either by contract or by state law, has the right to show the property with ordinarily 24 hours notice. However, if a tenant refuses, then except in the case of an emergency, a property owner or property manager cannot enter. To me, if a tenant's refusing to sign the PED, they are effectively saying, I don't want somebody to come in. If the tenant says, no, you can come in, I'm just not signing a PED, then you have to let the inspectors, appraisers, et cetera, know we cannot vouch for the status of the tenant in the property because they won't sign.
For the PED form, is there any specific format to send them in? PDF, picture, etc.?
Well, to me, you're sending, the best thing is you send it through Zip and you have it signed, DocuSign, right, or the other program. Either way, when you're sending something through Zip, it turns it into a PDF, I believe.
Yes.
So I don't think that really matters. The point is, you send it electronically, you get it signed electronically, you keep it electronically.
Yeah, I've had people send me a JPEG of the PDF. So that's, I think for that question, I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Any common mistakes we should look for when we're dealing with these Corona related documents?
Well, to me, a mistake that I've heard about, and again, you're the practitioner, Will, but a mistake I hear about is the form gets filled out, but it doesn't get dated. So there may be a property address, but it doesn't get dated. Well, that's one of the key aspects of the form is the date. So, but you can tell me about other issues that you're hearing that
I think that's the biggest one, or some of the myths that we talked about where people are putting in all or TBD or something like that. I think that's the biggest mistakes that I've been seeing as well.
Those are great.
Do we, as listing agents, have to give the buyer's agents all the signed PED forms when the transaction closes? So I think we answered that earlier, but go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, well, so the listing agent gives the seller all of the buyer's PED forms, but I don't think the listing agent has a duty to give the buyer's agent all of the PED forms for all of the other buyers that have came to the property. I don't have a problem if it's done. I just don't think it's a requirement.
I would agree. Here's a good one that I don't know if we can answer that question, but does E&O insurance protect us from COVID claims?
Yeah, I wish my colleague Jenny was here with me, but I don't think she'd stay around for an hour and a half for one question. And here's my understanding, is I think probably not. E&O insurance usually does not cover personal injury, and that's going to be the most likely COVID claim. I have been physically harmed because I've been afflicted with COVID-19. And so I think that's a probable no, a little outside my area.
TDS is mandatory and AVID is not mandatory in California. Is this correct?
How about if I give a yes and a no answer? It is not, the AVID, first of all, the TDS is statutorily required and contractually required. Okay? The AVID is not statutorily required, but it is contractually required. So when you say mandatory, you're talking about by statute or by contract. But either way, both need to be done because the contract requires them both.
How long is the PED form good for? I think we kind of talked about that before.
Right?
I think we already did that. Does the PED form have to be used in all counties, cities, regardless of their shelter-in-place status?
Okay, and the answer there is yes, with a reminder that if a county or city has a more restrictive SIP status, that needs to be complied with.
What do I do if another agent won't sign the PEAD form?
If you're the listing agent, you say you're not allowed entry. And if you have a way to control lockbox access, then you prohibit it.
Do COVID-related forms like the PED have to be signed digitally? I think the answer to that is absolutely yes.
Correct.
What do I have to have posted at the property? We talked about the 2 posted signs that needed to be done. How do I know which version of the forms I should use? It's a good question.
Yeah, so the answer there is so easy. Always go into zip form, because zip form will only have the most current version. Okay, so you don't have to go back and change form that was already used, but anytime you're going to use a form, check zip form. Only the most current version is available in zip form.
What if more people show up to a property than are on the form?
Then you say, guess what? No entry until you sign one.
I get to play bouncer again. Cool.
Yeah. Right.
Do I have to use the COVID contract C.A.R. made? What's the benefit?
The benefit, it protects you as a licensee, okay, from claims made by your client, whether it's a seller client or whether it's a buyer client, or from a non-client, quite honestly. And there's another benefit as well, which is not just to you specifically, but to the industry. And that is the real estate industry under state law has essential service status. And if the governor finds out that C.A.R. members or any licensees are just ignoring these rules, are not providing adequate forms, there's a possibility that status could be taken away and your business could be dramatically impacted.
And I think that's going to lead to another question that we've got. Here it is. Can I report agents that don't comply with the rules to the police, C.A.R. professional standards?
Okay, so whether it's the police or whether it's, you know, kind of like the COVID police or whatever, you know, agency is responsible for enforcing COVID laws, that's a personal decision on your part. As for C.A.R. and professional standards, C.A.R. and the local associations do not enforce the law per se. So let me give you an example, okay? So we talked about the difference between a traditional open house and the way showings are required right now, okay? C.A.R. does not police whether somebody has complied with the guidance, okay? But the local associations interpret the code of ethics, and the code of ethics prohibit any kind of untrue picture of the property. And so having an open house sign may lead somebody to say, yes, that's a violation of the guidance, but having an open house sign with no restrictive language or sign writer or something like that can be deemed to be as presenting an untrue picture of that property. And that's what could be pursued locally, not any kind of direct violation of the guidance.
Well, I think, and also one of our pro standards gurus, James Dill, says with an emphatic, yes, you can send somebody that is violating them to professional standards. So thank you, James, for chiming in there. All right, so we are almost done, folks. I appreciate that you have stayed with us 10 minutes over. Just need another few minutes. Just want to do some selfless plugs here for your COVID-19 resources. Please don't forget to check out the C.A.R. mini website for coronavirus. That's carcovidupdates.org. And then they've also got a specific transactional-legal part of it for all of the legal updates, any type of form updates, really, really good stuff. And then of course, locally, just for getting even deeper into our local rules and restrictions, if they've been updated, etc., you know where to go. You go to sccaor.com. And then we've also got our own transactional resource center, score.com/transaction. So I think we've got a couple more questions. So if people want to bug out, we absolutely understand, but we're here to answer some questions. So if you've got any questions for Neil's answers, please type them in the Q&A section. Neil, we've got a couple of questions. Is the Form CVA optional? Is this mandatory to be signed by a seller?
It is, the CVA is an optional form. It is there to try to address a contractual dispute, but it is not required at all. It's not required at the time of contract, and it's not required if somebody brings it up after a dispute arises. Hopefully it's there to help.
Great. Let's see. Diane asks, if the house is vacant, how does a listing agent really know who's showing up with the buyer's agent? How do we protect the seller?
If the house is vacant, the listing agent, as far as I know, does not know unless there is a way in your local, lockbox or key safe system that identifies who shows up. Now, do you know who the agent showed up with? No, you don't know. And you would just have to contact that licensee after the fact.
Richard points out that, again, in Santa Clara County, we need to be posting the county's green check form and their online form under penalty of perjury. Thank you again for that, Richard. And the last question that we've got is from Victoria. Can you discuss in summary about the listing agreement coronavirus addendum or amendment?
Okay, so my view is, unlike the CVA form, I think what we call the RLA CAA, I think that's the right acronym.
Yes.
The listing agreement addendum, I think you really should be using every time you take a listing. It informs the seller at that stage, and it gets the seller's permission about how you are going to handle showings and marketing the property in the coronavirus environment. So while it is an optional form, to me, it is a best practice form that should be used.
All right. Do we have any other questions from the group today? Yes, Karen asks, PV, does this allow 2 buyers plus 1 contractor plus buyers plus agent and myself to enter property? I thought PV is only allowed 2 people from the same household plus a buyer's agent.
Okay, so that goes to, the rules talk about buying parties, right? But when you're talking about an inspector, they're not really a buying party. So you have to figure out, what can you do that is compliant with all the other rules, including the social distancing rules. So the more people you're having in the property, the less likely you're going to be able to comply with the other rules, either local or the state rules. So to me, it's best to minimize the number of people who are there. If you have an inspector, I think you could probably have a licensee. You can probably have a buyer. Is there absolute clarity there? No. But why do you need 2, right? If you have 2 buyers, have one of them wait outside. Talk to the inspector afterwards, right? Why do you need to crowd into a home? I realize there may be some big homes, right? But there may be some smaller size homes as well. To me, you want to minimize to the maximum extent possible.
That's happened to me a couple of times, and I've not had a single buyer group that has refused to have somebody wait in the car. And a lot of times they're waiting in the car with a kid. So if they've got 2 kids, one parent will come in, or one of the adults will come in with one of the kids, and then they'll switch it up. People, if you explain these things to people, they understand, they get it. It's not, quote unquote, business as usual anymore.